So we had the fun reading, now down to the serious stuff. We continue our journey through the Easter season. And today we shift from the post-resurrection appearances to readings that reveal the nature of God's work in the world. I'm going to look at the John 10 reading and also the Psalm 23. Now, Christine didn't read Psalm 23, but we did sing that as the processional hymn this morning. Both readings draw on shepherding imagery. It's familiar imagery in the biblical tradition and the wider ancient Near Eastern culture. It was commonly used for leadership, for kings and rulers. And they were all seen and understood to be shepherds. Psalm 23 is familiar to most people and is often used at funerals. It's a scripture that reads beautifully and offers comfort. In this psalm, God, the Hebrew is, at this point, is Adonai, is the shepherd. It's often understood as comfort offered in the journey to the next life, the next chapter with God. And while this reading absolutely offers that comfort to people, it's important to understand that actually it also speaks into the now. It speaks to life and living. We read, "He restores my soul." And again, this is often understood as a restoration that occurs in the next life. Yet, it's the translation of the word to soul that leads us to that conclusion, when in reality, the Hebrew word that's translated as soul is nephesh, which means a living, breathing creature. This is the restoration of our life in the now. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, again often understood as being the darkness of death. Yet this psalm is expressing and acknowledging the darkness in life. There will always be moments of darkness and confrontation. And then there's the pronoun shift where it goes from Lord to you. And so what we hear then is this profound declaration of trust. The psalm is about the journey of life. It's a reminder to pause at the green pastures and the still waters, to give thanks, and to take the opportunity to receive the restoration that's offered by God. We move to John 10, and that's understood to be part of Jesus' last public discourse. And the larger context of today's reading begins back at chapter 9 and emerges out of the conflict with religious authorities in the healing of the man born blind. We're now invited to identify Jesus through the actions and metaphors of healer, door, gate, and shepherd. Jesus declares, "Ego eimi hopomen hokalos." I am the good shepherd. Since the beginning of this narrative to this point, this is the third ego eimi, I am declaration. This declaration is understood to point to the divine nature of Jesus. The mission of Jesus and God are woven together. The revelation of the intimate relationship between Father and Son is revealed. And whilst we're on the Greek, kalos, while translated as good, a more accurate translation would be noble, or model, or genuine, which fits quite well when we think of the social environment and the cultural significance of honour and shame. The shepherd imagery of John 10 draws on Psalm 23, the provider of food, water, protection. The Good Shepherd is life-giving. The Good Shepherd plane pause. I got used to that in Sydney when the planes used to go to church. Anywho, back. The shepherd imagery of John 10 and draws on Psalm 23. The good shepherd stands in honour. The hired hand will bring shame as they flee when danger presents and threatens. One of the problems with the shepherding imagery, like much of the imagery in biblical tradition, is it's been romanticised and domesticated. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. If the image of a stained glass window with Jesus, complete with lamb draped over their shoulder, is the first thing that comes to mind, then really the best way to view that, not using violent language of a brick going through it, I'll actually use, is to envision it with lightning striking it and breaking it into small pieces. Whether we understand first century shepherding in its literal context or as metaphor for leadership, the landscape is harsh, it's risky, and it's dangerous. For Jesus, as the inaugurator, as the leader of the kingdom movement, the path and journey of his leadership cost him his life. His life and ministry was about leading people in the way of the kingdom, the values of which ran and continue to run contrary to the values of the world in which we live. Those values are justice, peace, mercy, love, compassion. In his life and death, Jesus expressed these values non-violently. We gather this morning and we acknowledge it's ANZAC Day. Far from a day of celebration, today is a day of lament. It's a day where we acknowledge that more than 130,000 lives were lost. More than 260,000 were wounded. Both figures are, of course, estimates. As I researched ANZAC Day, I struggled. I struggled as I read the objective was to capture Constantinople. Allies began looking at ways to exploit their superior sea power. It was about invasion and destruction. It was about domination and power over and control of. And why would I be surprised, really? Because this is what war and conflict is about. We have, throughout this worship space, perspex figures. Each one represents a life lost in war. They represent real people, sons, fathers, brothers, that never returned home to loved ones. And I did think, unfortunately, there are no silhouettes to represent the women that lost their lives during the war. Maybe that's another project. ANZAC Day is a day we talk about remembering. And indeed, we must remember. We must remember the pain and the horror and the abuse of war. Today we remember ANZAC Day, 25th of April, 1916. It doesn't end there. We remember World War I, 1914 to 1918. World War II, 1939 to 1945. The Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975. The Falklands War, 1982. The invasion of Kuwait, 1990. War in Iraq, 2003. And all of these are the well-known wars and just the tip of the iceberg. Conflict in Yemen continues. Conflict in Papua continues. Conflict begins to erupt, it seems, daily somewhere in the world. We must remember, and we must learn. As disciples, we need to head back to the scriptures and hear once more that the kingdom movement proclaimed by Jesus was non-violent. The life and ministry of Jesus was lived and carried out non-violently, even in the way he faced his death at the hands of the powers. We're called to work for peace. The idea of Jesus laying down his life is not to be compared to soldiers at war. Jesus laying down his life is a no to injustice and violence. I've spoken with people over the years, and what I hear is not so much a commitment to, but more of an entrapment by the just war theory. The just war theory has two elements. A war is only a just war if it's both justified and carried out in the right way. So I'm interested what the justification is for killing and torturing another human being, for invading and destroying the homeland of a neighbour. And then, what's actually the right way to kill and pillage? Is there a protocol that one must follow? I've no doubt that decisions made during wartime are painstaking and create anxiety for the decision makers, anxiety that would make our blood run cold. But try as we might, I believe it's impossible to justify war. In the act of remembering, we must remember that violence and war has never and will never bring about true peace. What it does is establish power and control. As Thomas Merton puts it, power can guarantee the interest of some, but it can never foster the good of all. Only love can attain and preserve the good of all. Violence is present in our world in many forms. Ultimately, the economic, social and political order in which we live was built largely by violence, is extended by violence, and maintained by violence. This is the truth. We may not like it, but it's truth. While violence in any form exists in the world, there'll be no true peace, there'll be no true freedom. The call to discipleship is a call to a life of non-violence, to find alternative ways of living in the world. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 said, "It's no longer a choice, my friends, between violence and non-violence. It's either non-violence or non-existence." As we reflect on the beautiful words of Psalm 23, let's hear the comfort and that beautiful poetry, but go beyond and hear the costly, challenging topic of love your enemy. Because the table is prepared in the midst and presence of enemies. The journey of life will lead us to moments of darkness and confrontation. How we respond is the key. So I'm going to offer a short silence before I pray. And I ask that during this silence, we remember all of those lives that were lost on ANZAC Day. But I take it further. Please remember those who continue today to face the prospect of being sent to the front line. Please remember the people in our defence forces who have felt that suicide is their only way out. Please remember the veterans and the families who live with PTSD and disabilities. Remember every person who is not in the defence force who has lost their life. Remember every person who fears that when they step outside of their home, they may never return. So remember all people of all nations. Holy One. You have heard the thoughts and prayers of your people. Send your Spirit to weave them together, to create a pattern of love and peace. May the bombs of bullets that bring harm and death become bread that brings life. Amen.